All right, so we're going to take a deep dive into the neo-Nazi movement in Germany.
Okay.
Specifically, why it seems to be gaining traction. And we've got kind of a mix of sources for this. We've got video interviews with actual neo-Nazis in Germany, and a news report about similar groups in Australia.
Yeah, it's fascinating how open the neo-Nazis are in these videos about their beliefs. They talk about their everyday lives, their routines, like their extremist views are totally normal. And they live openly in Dortmund-Dorstfeld, which is a neighborhood known for its nationalist sentiment.
It's kind of like watching a documentary about everyday life.
Yeah.
You know, but with this like unsettling undercurrent of extremist ideology. I mean, they're parents, workers, neighbors. It's almost more unnerving than if they were like living on the fringes of society.
Yeah, I think that's the danger of normalization. You know, when these ideologies just seep into everyday life, they become less shocking and they become more acceptable and therefore easier to spread.
Right, so let's get into what they're actually saying. One major theme that kind of comes up over and over again is this intense anti-immigration sentiment. They talk about immigrants taking over, diluting German culture, leading to like societal decay. It's a very Germany for Germans kind of mentality.
Yeah, and it's interesting how they specifically link the decline of German culture to the influx of immigrants. For example, one neo-Nazi talks about how immigrants are bringing crime and unemployment, directly leading to the breakdown of traditional German values. You know, so this kind of rhetoric really preys on economic anxieties.
Oh yeah, it's like creating this scapegoat for very complex societal problems. And it's not just about economics either. There's also this thread of historical revisionism running through a lot of their argument. They're minimizing or even denying the Holocaust, claiming that it's like irrelevant to their current struggles.
Right, it's a way to kind of distance themselves from the most horrific aspects of Nazi ideology and to present a more sanitized version that's more appealing to a broader audience. But the underlying message is clear. They see a pure German identity that is under threat.
Yeah, and it's not just about keeping Germany pure either. They also draw parallels to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, expressing solidarity with Palestinians, calling Israel's actions a genocide.
Yeah, this is where things get really complex. They're using this conflict to legitimize their own anti-Semitism, framing it as a fight against oppression, while ignoring the historical context of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and, you know, the unique horrors of the Holocaust.
It's almost like they're trying to rebrand anti-Semitism as some form of social justice. Very calculated and disturbing distortion of history. But here's where it gets even more concerning. This Australian news report reveals that this isn't just a German issue. Neo-Nazi groups are actually gaining traction worldwide.
Yeah, and they're using similar tactics. Exploiting economic anxieties, scapegoating immigrants, and manipulating historical narratives to appeal to a wider audience. What's particularly alarming is how they're using online platforms to connect, to share tactics, and to spread their messages across borders.
So we're seeing a global network of hate emerging, fueled by these shared anxieties and ideologies. It's not just isolated pockets of extremism anymore.
Exactly. And their actions are escalating as well. The Australian report describes neo-Nazis holding rallies, confronting counter-protesters, even doxing police officers. And their rhetoric is becoming increasingly violent, particularly when they perceive threats to their families and children.
So they're going from online hate speech to real-world intimidation and potentially violence. What's driving this escalation? Is it just a matter of feeling emboldened by their growing numbers? Or is there something more at play here?
Well, I think it's probably a combination of factors. The perceived threat from immigration, the economic anxieties, the validation they find in online communities, and perhaps even a sense of disillusionment with mainstream politics. All of these are contributing to this very volatile mix, you know?
Okay.
Yeah, and we can't overlook the role of political rhetoric. I mean, these groups often find validation in the words of certain politicians who exploit those same fears and anxieties. For example, the interviews with American neo-Nazis reveal a strong admiration for Donald Trump and his America First rhetoric.
It's like they see him as this figurehead for their movement, someone who's legitimizing their worldview on a global stage. It makes you wonder about the, the unintended consequences of populist rhetoric. And how it can embolden these extremist groups.
Absolutely. It's a very complex issue, but that line between mainstream politics and extremist ideology is becoming increasingly blurred. And that's a dangerous trend.
Yeah, going back to the German interviews for a second, one thing that really struck me was How the neo-Nazis expressed surprise at the interviewer's nervousness. They claimed they were just normal people who happened to have different views.
Right, that's a classic tactic, to
Yeah.
downplay the threat they pose. And to make their ideologies seem less extreme, they present themselves as ordinary folks, relatable even, to gain a wider acceptance. But we can't be fooled by this facade.
It's a chilling reminder that hate can wear a friendly face. It's not always about, shaved heads and swastikas. It can be lurking right next door, disguised as normalcy. And that's what makes it so insidious.
And effective. By appealing to everyday concerns and anxieties, they can attract those who might not otherwise identify with overt displays of neo-Nazism.
Right.
It's a subtle form of recruitment that's very hard to counter.
So how do we combat this? How do we prevent these ideologies from spreading further, especially when they're disguised as everyday concerns?
Well, it's a complex challenge. But I think awareness is the first step. We need to be able to recognize these ideologies. Even when they're presented in a more palatable package, we need to understand their tactics, their rhetoric, their underlying motivations.
It's like learning to spot a wolf in sheep's clothing. You got to be able to see through the disguise and recognize the danger for what it is.
Exactly. And then we need to counter their narratives with facts, with evidence, with compassion. We need to challenge their distorted views of history and expose the flaws in their logic.
But it's not just about winning arguments either, right? We need to address the root causes of this extremism. The social and economic inequalities, the political polarization, the sense of alienation and disenfranchisement. That drives people towards these ideologies in the first place.
Absolutely. We need to create a society where everyone feels valued, respected, and included. A society where people have a sense of belonging and hope for the future. That's the best way to prevent these ideologies from taking root.
It sounds like a monumental task, but it's one we can't afford to ignore. We have a responsibility to confront this hate, to challenge these ideologies, and to build a better world for future generations.
I couldn't agree more. And it starts with each of us. By educating ourselves, by speaking out against injustice, by promoting tolerance and understanding, we can make a difference.
This has been a sobering but essential conversation. It's clear that the rise of neo-Nazism is a complex and disturbing phenomenon, but it's also clear that we have the power to resist it.
Right.
It starts with understanding, with awareness, with a commitment to action. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
Thanks.
While we were discussing these neo-Nazi groups, I kept thinking about their fixation on purity and how they kind of manipulate history to fit that narrative.
It's unsettling how they twist events and cherry-pick facts to create this warped sense of history. They downplay the Holocaust, glorify certain aspects of Nazi Germany, and ignore anything that contradicts their ideology.
It's like they're trying to build this fantasy world based on a totally whitewashed version of the past. But this historical revisionism, it's not just about romanticizing the past, right?
No, it's about creating a foundation for their ideology in the present. They're trying to legitimize their hatred and violence by claiming it's a continuation of some glorious historical struggle. But of course, it's a distorted one.
Yeah, and they use this twisted history to justify their actions today. They claim they're the victims, fighting to protect their heritage and culture. It's a complete distortion of reality. But it's a powerful message for those who feel disenfranchised or left behind.
Absolutely, they prey on people's anxieties, their fears of cultural change, their sense of displacement. And they offer this very simple solution: return to a mythical past, where everything was supposedly better.
So how do we reach those who are falling prey to this rhetoric? How do we kind of break through the indoctrination and show them a different path?
Well, it's a challenge, because they often reject any information that contradicts their worldview. They see outsiders as the enemy, as part of the problem.
So traditional methods of education and debate might not be effective.
They can be, but I think we need to be more creative, more strategic. It's about finding ways to engage them in dialogue without immediately challenging their deeply held beliefs. It's about building relationships, fostering empathy, and planting seeds of doubt.
It sounds like a delicate and painstaking process. But is there hope for those who are already deeply entrenched in this ideology? Can they ever truly break free?
There are individuals and organizations working tirelessly to do just that. They use a variety of approaches, from counseling and support groups to educational programs and community outreach. And there are success stories, people who have managed to escape the clutches of these groups and rebuild their lives.
That's a glimmer of hope in what often feels like a very dark landscape.
It is. It reminds us that even in the face of hate and extremism, there's always hope for redemption, for change, for a better future. But it requires a collective effort. We all have a role to play in combating these ideologies.
This deep dive has certainly been eye-opening. We've uncovered a really complex web of social, economic, and political factors that contribute to the rise of neo-Nazism.
Yeah. And we've seen how these groups exploit anxieties, manipulate history, and use sophisticated tactics to spread their message and recruit new members.
But we've also seen the resilience of those who fight back, who challenge these ideologies, and who work tirelessly to build a more just and equitable world.
It's a reminder that we can't be complacent. We can't afford to be silent. We need to be vigilant, informed, and engaged. The future of our society depends on it.
Well said. This deep dive has been a sobering but essential journey. It's clear that the rise of neo-Nazism is a complex and urgent challenge, but it's also clear that we have the power to resist it. It starts with understanding, with awareness, with a commitment to action. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.